Awesome. This is our last fireside chat for the day, I think.
Cool.
Happy to introduce Aaron Zollman, CISO and VP of Platform Engineering at Cedar, also a tech company located here in New York. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Cedar?
Sure. So Cedar is a health tech business. We're about 8 years old, and our goal is to empower patients to affordably pursue the care they need. So what we primarily do is sell software to healthcare providers. So this is going to be large hospital systems, physician groups who have patients all over the country to make a better billing experience for patients. And I think anyone who has experienced the U.S. healthcare system has experienced a terrible billing experience, and so our job is to make that better.
Data in hospitals is something interesting. I recently had to transfer data from one hospital to another, and the only way to do that was to burn the data onto a disk and bring it to the other hospital. So I imagine like compliance is a big topic for you guys.
Yeah, so managing data and handling it is huge for us. The minimum thing we have to do is meet HIPAA requirements, which on the face of it are pretty straightforward, right? I need to be able to track anyone who accesses someone's health data and then be able to explain to a regulator if asked who and why. So on the face of it, that's fairly simple. In practice, all of our clients, as large hospital systems, have their own requirements to try and reduce risk further. And so we really want to think holistically, not just about how do I track and minimize access to patient data, but also how do I make it clear, straightforward, transparent to our clients, regulators, sort of anyone who needs to know who has access to what. And that's going to be true anywhere. It's going to be true on all of the systems that we run, most of which are in the cloud. It's going to be true on the third-party systems that we interact with, which might include the provider systems, and it's certainly going to be true about our physical spaces as well.
Where do you manage all these different hierarchies of levels of access for these data systems?
It's managed in a couple places. And so I think one of the things that we're pretty proud of, and I'll just point it at John, who built a lot of it and is in the audience today, is there's really three main places that we're trying to integrate. So at the top of the hierarchy is the HR system. And that has its own complexities, right? HR systems don't have the data you want, but they typically have the baseline things you care about. Who is this person? What is their email address? And in our case, ideally, it's what's their main office, where are they located? But that doesn't give you like all of the details. What should they have access to? Like, it will tell you, for example, that someone is in IT, but it doesn't necessarily tell you that they should have access to the server rooms. Or they should have access to like some sort of administrative, it doesn't have like clearance level. And so downstream from the HR system is our identity provider and our core identity system. So effectively Okta. And that's where we end up using, that's what we end up using as a source of truth for the rest of the access data. And there's a series of tools that we can use to manage it that we can happy to go into, but that becomes sort of the source of truth for what we do. And then the rest of the work that we're doing is about automating the connection between those two systems, the downstream systems where we need to manage access, as well as all of the other systems that we use for security monitoring, security response, and just operating the business, right? It's a small team, small IT team, and so what we're really trying to do is make sure that we have clarity and transparency for all of these compliance needs, while also running it without having a group of people who are just handling access tickets all day.
So you need to automate a lot?
We automate a lot. We don't just automate with code, right? Like some of it's code, but some of it's stuff that's native in the tools itself.
And are there any what's the craziest automations you built? I assume it's when someone starts at your company, they need to get all these crazy different levels of permissions. And is this something that you have fully automated, or is this still you or someone else needing to manually interfere?
At this point, nearly everything in both onboarding and both onboarding and offboarding is fully automated.
Cool.
And so I guess it depends on what you define as the craziest thing we've built. it builds up through time, right? I think, when we started, a lot of it was manual, right? And then we realized that there were 10 systems we handled, every day. And so we started to look at what the volume of tickets were and automate those first. As time went by, we learned more about what role changes looked like, what certain subsets of users would be, and we'd automate provisioning, group membership, and even business rules about who would have access to what as new systems sort of came into being and as we learned more about what people needed. But in terms of the craziest thing we built, I think even getting this thing started was hard. Because you want to have the HR system as a source of truth, right? Like, you don't want to rely on your people operations team putting in an IT ticket when someone leaves. You don't want to rely on getting a text when there's a emergency transition. You want this stuff to really be tied into the system that they use in order for it to have the most effect. And so I think one of the hardest things to do early on is take these big legacy, painful HR systems and tie them into the more modern, nimble IT stuff that we like to use. Because at the end of the day, it's great to buy nimble tools, but they're not all available. And so it was really definitely a hacky job. We configured the HR system to produce a daily report and dump it on a file share. And then we had to build automation that looked for the presence of a changed file on that file share, automatically look at it, parse it, compare it to what was in Okta today, and then make those changes automatically. So I think that was kind of a bit of a messy integration. Certainly had its had days where it broke somewhat dramatically. But having done that successfully, we've saved hundreds, probably thousands of tickets since we put in the effort to do that initial implementation.
And I think you're talking about interconnected islands and zero trust. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so I guess one of the things that's just been listening to the conversations today and the way the workplace changes, and it ties together sort of a theme that we're thinking about a lot is security engineers, as well as I think the workplace stuff we're talking about is in workplace. You used to have this one big office or like 5 or 6 big offices that everyone worked in, and so a couple access patterns are pretty straightforward, right? You'd be looking to see like who came into the office on one day, but that's not true in workplace. Now, there's a lot of flex workspaces. People are downsizing. And I think it is in the types of systems that we use and interact with, it's even become more true. So the big buzzword I think that a lot of us security people talk about is called zero trust access. And zero trust access is basically this idea that instead of having one big corporate environment behind a firewall in a data center, you're really thinking about how do you secure different interconnected islands. So like, yes, I do have a cloud environment where some of our services live, but my users are also accessing Salesforce. My users are also, doing technical drawings, accessing third-party health record systems. And so we really have to build the system that is robust to any application anywhere and really takes into account everything we know about that user before we grant them access. So I don't know. There's an interesting story that's like unique to us where we can start to bring together data from different places. One of the things that is particularly important with our data is that we have regulatory restrictions on data leaving the United States. A lot of states and several of our clients are pretty strict about data locality. We're not primarily in Europe, but they care a lot about it too. And so by having all of these systems integrated, we can make decisions based not just on where the person's job is, but also based on where they're logging in from, where we last physically saw them. And so there's some really interesting things that we can do there. I don't want to oversell that. We're not, we're not sort of like in real time dynamically doing any like updating access based on, the last office you badged into. But we definitely do use it as a signal. One of the cool things that we're able to do is pull all of this data into our security monitoring platform. And so if we do see, for example, that someone is outside the United States for a period of time, that does trigger like a bit of follow-up and questions about, hey, like, do we need to adjust their access to be more focused on like what an international employee should have versus someone based in the United States?
So that would create a ticket that you cannot.
Actually, don't know how it works today. Is it ticket, or do they actually automatically get moved between groups, John? Do you know? It's still ticket? Yeah, still a ticket in this case.
But it sounds like you're thinking a lot about broader identities and holistic identities. Is this a concept that you?
Yeah. So I mean, I think this is something that anyone who's gonna join this journey needs to think about users not just as like, 5 or 6 fields, right? It's not just a user, a badge ID, an email address. There's a lot more that we've had to track, and so we have some, I think, hard-won lessons about that as we've grown the system, right? The first is that we and the HR organization, People Ops, had to decide, who is authoritative, like who is the core team for deciding like what organization you're in. Because a lot of access is driven by like what organization you're in, what you're working for. But a lot of access is not actually driven by who you report to. And so one of the things that we had to kind of go into a little bit of a debate about, and where we ended up deciding that we, the IT organization, would be closer to authoritative for it, is the notion of what team you're on. And so we're a software development organization. What that means is your manager might be the head of product management. Your manager might be the head of customer success. But the project you're working on might be a specific client, a specific provider, or the project you're working on might be a specific service that we're selling. And in those cases, the access that you have has to track what you're working on as opposed to your management. And so I think
so it's project-based.
It's more project-based access. And so I think that was maybe a little bit of a harder one lesson. I think when we started this thing, we thought we'd be able to drive it more directly based on the data that we got from the people team. And I think we realized, a couple months in, that that we had to be a little bit more proactive about managing that ourselves and working specifically with business units to understand how they thought about projects. So that was an interesting, like, holistic identity lesson that we needed to learn. I think there's any number of lessons around every rule has exceptions. People generally shouldn't work internationally, based on what we do, but there are always exceptions where you need to allow it, and so you have to be able to build exceptions into your processes. And then another fun one that we learned, building out data-driven accesses, is you always need to make sure you're thinking about tripwires and break class access, because we've definitely had days where, the Wi-Fi is down, or a file movement job breaks in the middle, and you don't want to accidentally kick all of your employees out of a critical application.
Too much automation sometimes.
Too much automation can go awry if you don't have the firewalls and the guardrails in place. And I think we've tripped over every one of those in the past 3-4 years as we've built this out.
Do some of your projects require in-person work, or it doesn't really matter?
So most of our projects don't require in-person work. We have an office. It's 15 minutes away from here, but most of our work is done remotely. However, we used to run service centers. So as patients have problems and need to call in, we would have a physical location where people came to. And obviously during COVID, we had to be able to support that work without having a physical location people would came to. And so we had to build kind of workarounds. So we still have the physical location. There's still some things we do there. But now, just about any activity that we perform, we need to be able to have a compensating, remote workflow. So, in those service center applications, we still have the requirement to, limit access to health data to people who are authorized to use it. And so, if you're a remote employee who is likely to be dealing with a lot of personal data, right? Most engineers on most days are not going to be dealing with people's health data, but most service center employees, most patient advocates will. We do have some additional requirements that we put on both your computer as well as the workspace where you are working to make sure that we can meet sort of regulatory requirements.
So when you get started with something like this, how do you even start rolling this out? I guess you would start to needing to understand, like audit yourself in a way, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think we understand what we're trying to do, which is simplify, create a record, and reduce the number of tickets that we have to handle. And so I think it's helpful to start with that manual sense.
So that's your perfect world's image.
The perfect world, right? Perfect automation that never fails. Touches everything, no systems out of scope, operated with 0 people so that the IT team can spend more time maintaining teleconferencing systems. I don't know. And so we do need to understand, a couple things up front. Like there's one thing that was really helpful by starting with a vision of where we wanted to go was creating this idea of access tiers. We talk about things in terms of red, yellow, and green. And it's a good framework for thinking, what are the most highly sensitive, must have eyes on, must have full detail, somewhat sensitive, need to be limited to employees, but it's okay if you automatically provision it versus, lighter weight systems. We had this sort of loose idea of what the world needs to look like. But when we started, it was really, where is our time going and what are the systems that are the hardest, the most important to prioritize? And that's going to be a mix of, we're getting a lot of tickets, they're hard to manage, they have a high error rate because they can be complex to deploy to, and they're also really sensitive, so we need more reliable audit data that goes into them.
I think you also mentioned that in your offboarding workflows, you have pretty physical things like boxes being sent out. And stuff.
Yeah, so this is actually kind of cool as well. Having gotten the basic automation right for system access, for door access, we're able to tie other workflows to it as well. And so, now that folks are remote, we have core workflows built out for a lot of this stuff. We're able to tie in, a system that automatically sends a shipping label in a box out to an offboarding employee. They put their laptop in and it returns it directly to us. And it's one of those things that would have been, I think, certainly time prohibitive and not particularly worth automating at first. But now, since it's just another step in the already built out, already instrumented offboarding workflow, this kind of thing over the course of a couple of years has really grown up to be something we're really proud of, that ties together a whole bunch of systems and requires very little of the team's time to do boring toil. And
how do you receive critical alerts? Do you use Slack for that, or in your SIEM if you see anything?
In our case, Slack and SIEM are the way we operate. So, on the back end, data from all of our core systems goes into our security monitoring systems. We've built a bunch of alerts based on that. That for us, primarily fires into Slack. There's PagerDuty aspects of it as well, if it's a particularly critical incident. But also, again, having built this out over a period of time, using the SIEM as a landing spot for a lot of this data means that if there is an incident or we need to, review, we get a signal of abnormal activity on an employee's laptop, for example, all of the data, physical, virtual, et cetera, is centralized, and we can really look and build a profile of what was expected and what was not in a user's activity.
Do you use any Kisi specific alerts?
So we've basically set it up so that there's two sets of things that we file, we flow directly into our SIM and we care about. The first is administrative changes. So if we see administrative changes that aren't done by the automation, like that's something that I monitor. And we do that across a bunch of systems. So Kisi is sort of another implementation of manual administrative monitoring that we do. That doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It just means that it's something we want to follow into, because administrative changes, especially administrative changes that are done manually, can often be a signal of something that you need to look into. And then we don't really have any, I think, detailed alerting on door unlock events, but we do track them because that's often useful on the back end when you want to build alerting, and quite frankly, because the people team often finds it useful for reporting as well.
Cool. And it sounds like you could do endless work. When are you done with your automations? How do you know you're
when am
good
I
enough?
done with the automations? I think we're done when we have things that we're more interested in working on than automation. But I think that's honestly the meat of it. We're always bringing in new systems, right? The environment is always changing, and so we're never fully done. But I think what we're happy to be able to say is, for the last several audits, being able to report on access grants and terminations, being able to report on physical controls have not been a thing that we've been concerned about because having built the system, it becomes very easy to respond to those requirements.
Awesome.
Cool.
Any questions? Very technical, but it makes it work and keeps the IT team lean and happy.
Yeah. So happy to do whiteboard drawings or whatever with.
So what would you, if you had a whiteboard here, what would you put on it?
Yeah. So I think we're actually having some side conversations in the halls earlier today, and we were talking about, order of operations and how to build these hierarchies, what tools to use for what purposes. So in our system, it's a little bit of hand-built automation for some of the HR sync stuff, a little bit of Okta workflows, which can be used to handle sort of triggers and move data between systems. A lot of rule-based hierarchies. So for example, employees should have permanent access to the building. I don't need to create a workflow that handles that trigger, right? I just tie it. If you're a member of the New York employees group, then you also have access to the building. So it's not a workflow. It's just picking the right tool for the job. And then the last thing is how to keep all of these different downstream systems in sync. You have a couple options there. Kisi uses SCIM. So SCIM is basically for folks who don't know, it's a fairly standard way of connecting an identity service like Okta to an application like Kisi. And so because of that, we effectively have a handful of groups in Okta that result in physical access, and then we can use SCIM downstream. And so when we were kind of talking about this in the halls, we had put together a little drawing of like, here are the hierarchies, here's the path in which the systems flow, and here's the tools that we recommend for each step in the process.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Aaron.
Chris, good to meet you.
Yeah.